and Compliance, which is part of the Center for Research Quality. Do you want to say hi, Jenny?
Hello, everyone.
Also listed on this first slide is Leilani Endicott, who is the Director of the Office of Research, Ethics, and Compliance. And Leilani is not going to be able to join us today, but we are in great hands with Jenny. So before we get started with today's webinar, I'd just like to do a few housekeeping things. If you have never been to a GoToWebinar, or if today is, or if it's been a while, I'd just like to remind you of how you can participate. First of all, remember that if you just see the small control panel, you should see the whole control panel, but if you just see the small version of it on your screen, all you need to do is click on that little red or that little orange arrow there that you see highlighted by the red box, and your entire control panel will open up for you again. That will allow you to toggle back and forth so that you can see your screen and be able to participate in the webinar. You can adjust your audio as needed. Just click on the audio settings there that you see highlighted in the red box. You can do that anytime during the webinar if you have a need to. The rest of the participants can't hear the audio setup, so you can do that as needed. There's a couple ways you can participate and ask questions through the webinar. Well, one of the things we'll do is have a poll. So when we get to the poll, we'll ask you to participate in that. But throughout the webinar, you can ask questions in a couple of ways. First, you can just go ahead and type them into that question box there. I'll be monitoring that throughout the webinar, and I'll pose those questions to Jenny as they come up. If you'd like to pose your questions or your comments verbally, you can click on the Raise Your Hand button that's highlighted in red right now, and then I can see that you have something you want to share. So I can unmute you at that time, and you can then interact with both Jenny and I and anyone else who is unmuted. Do note that everyone is muted for the time being. We notice that in GoToWebinar, unless we mute the entire audience, we get a lot of background noise. That can be distracting, and it can be hard to hear the presenters. Whoops, I went ahead a little bit too fast there. If you need technical support, there is a number on your screen. Go ahead and call them. They can help you out with any issues that you have. We also have closed captioning available for today's event. The closed captioning link is in the questions area. So just go ahead and click on that link and you can get closed captioning if you need that. And an evaluation will be provided at the end of the webinar so you can give us some feedback. So my voice did hold up for that little bit. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny, and she can share her knowledge and her understanding of the IRB process and what you need to do to ensure that you are meeting expectations for conducting research in your workplace. Jenny?
Great. Thank you so much, Lori, and welcome, and thank you to everyone who is joining us today. Just to give a little introduction about myself in case you don't know me, again, my name is Jenny Shear. I am the Associate Director in the Office of Research, Ethics, and Compliance. I'm better known as one of the IRB ladies, for better or for worse, but a large part of what I do in the university is working with both students and faculty to help them understand what needs, what is needed to get through the IRB review, and not just to get through it, to be able to get to data collection. And believe me, we are very aware that students are very excited to move on to data collection by the time they hit IRB, but also to really help them understand why an IRB review is necessary, so that so they don't feel like we're just picking on them unnecessarily, but to really help them understand that the points that we're trying to make are ultimately to help make their studies better and stronger, and to really help offer them that kind of almost professional development for their student career, to really help them as they not only are able to apply it to their own research, but can then take it with them as Walden alumni. And again, today's focus is really helping to understand issues that need to be considered when researchers, whether it be a student researcher or even you as faculty, if you are planning studies, and whether you're planning to do it here at Walden. Many of our faculty have alternate lives at other organizations or other schools, wanting to conduct your own research at another place of employment, just issues to consider when conducting research in your own workplace. And again, we do have some very specific outcomes. First, again, trying to identify the exact ethical issues to consider. Again, from the student perspective, it's because of issues or problems that they've identified in their workplace, or perhaps a trend or a topic that they would like to learn more about or to learn how to address, is an impetus that caused them to go to school in the first place. They're very excited to obtain the skills and the knowledge to be able to address or tackle the issue that they're seeing in their own workplace. And especially specific to a lot of the professional doctorates, it is really expected that students address a local problem. This, really ultimately requires that they, conduct a study that's specific to their own workplace. So it is certainly something where we're seeing a lot of students that want to do this, and we certainly want to do what we can to help support them in those instances. A large part of that kind of leads into that second bullet there is, understanding the impact of the professional role of the researcher as it relates to potential participants. And this really is one of the crux issues that the IRB considers. We often get questions about whether it's okay to conduct research in one's place of employment without any additional information. And unfortunately, it's really hard to provide any more feedback beyond that, because we just can't address, well, if you are, are you conducting research with your students? Are you a CEO of an organization? What's the nature? How are you planning to collect the data? Certainly on the very general level, of course, students can conduct research at their place of employment. It's the next step that we really need to take a closer look at to help students understand the issues that they'll need to consider as they are developing their proposal in that regard. And finally, trying to identify some practical points to help students, and again, even for your own research, of how to conduct research within one's own workplace. Again, the reality is that a lot of our students purposely come to Walden because of the social change mission. They're very driven to identify solutions or to identify the research to lay the foundation for a solution to be able to affect very real and positive local social change, which is very commendable. And we, like I said before, we really want to support that. However, at the same time, as much as we want to support that, there are some unique risks associated with conducting research where you are employed at your own workplace. And it is those risks that we need to take a little bit of a closer look at, just to make sure that students are ensuring that the participants are adequately protected, and at the same time keeping themselves above reproach. Do you want to go to the next slide, Lori? Okay. Before we get into the nuts and bolts that's very specific to the workplace environment, I did want to lay a bit of a foundation. Some of you may have heard, depending on what circles you have been in, what academic circles, but what the purpose of the IRB is again, is to look at those, the ethical implications of the study to ensure that human participants are protected. There are quite a few historical studies from the early to mid part of the 20th century where participants really were ultimately just misused, mistreated, in some cases abused. There are studies where children, institutionalized children, were fed feces in order to infect them with hepatitis, because those researchers were looking to try to find new medicines, essentially, or to understand the disease better. And again, while the ultimate end was commendable, the method that they used was certainly not appropriate, dealing with children that had no ability to say no and to have nobody look out for them. Other studies included jury deliberations where they were recorded without their knowledge or consent. And there is some back and forth as far as, what is considered a private discussion, but at the same time, really just taking advantage of the situation without giving people the benefit of the doubt or giving them a heads up. And ultimately, the most well-known study kind of leading up to where these principles that we use as our foundation is the Tuskegee syphilis study, which is where researchers purposefully withheld syphilis medication from poor African Americans in the South because they were trying to see how the disease naturally progressed. Again, in an effort to try to better the medical options for treating the disease, but at the same time, these are people that really were not given much of an option, and it is because of a lot of these past studies. And again, it's researchers all with good intentions. It's not people intentionally going out to try to hurt or harm people, but really just getting lost and focused on the end result, rather than really considering about what their current steps are doing to their participants. As a result of these past studies, a commission was formed, and the ultimate result of that was in 1979, a document called the Belmont Report was created. And the purpose of that was to identify ethical issues that need to be considered when research involves human subjects. And this report is essentially the foundation that IRBs across the United States use when trying to determine the level of risk or ethical issues and ethical implications of the study to make sure that participants are adequately protected. There are three basic ethical principles which are listed here: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And to put these in more practical terms, respect for persons, is essentially treating individuals as what we would call autonomous agents. They are capable of determining whether or not they want to participate. They need to be seen as people who are capable of making their own decisions. But at the same time, we also need to recognize that there are going to be circumstances where there are people that have limited autonomy or limited ability to make their own decisions or to understand what elements of the study in order to make that informed decision. And so we definitely want to make sure that we have additional protections in place. A large part of ensuring respect for persons comes during the consent process, and we'll talk about this a little bit more as it relates specifically to the work environment. But the largest part of this that I would certainly want to convey to you and would encourage you to convey to your students is understanding that the consent is definitely a process. It's not just a signature on a form, but really helping to ensure people are aware of what the study entails, and really making sure that the consent process is tailored at that level so that they have the necessary information and can make an informed decision about whether or not to participate. Beneficence, the next ethical principle, is basically the adage of do no harm. It's essentially applying the principle of respecting individuals' decisions and really doing what's possible to not force them to participate in the study. Again, it's that voluntary participation, and we always want to make sure that the benefits of a given study are maximized and certainly outweigh any potential risks of the study. And again, especially specific to the workplace environment, a very large risk is the potential for perceived coercion, and part of that is managing that perception and making sure that people really understand that if they feel that they want to participate, they can, but it's not a requirement. And finally, justice. And again, this one is very relevant because it relates to making sure that people that participate in research also benefit from it. And again, it's the concept of not using a population solely out of convenience. Again, those past studies, using institutionalized children or prisoners, or even in today's, using school children sometimes. It's very easy to focus the study and then to recruit because there's a captive audience. But at the same time, it does raise additional issues that need to be considered because in order to ethically justify conducting a study in certain locations, the population that will be participating should be able to benefit in some way. So for example, if it's taking the school example, it makes sense if the topic under study is education focused. That certainly makes sense to use a school population, but if the topic is, understanding preferred beverage intakes for teenagers, well then just because a researcher works at a school doesn't mean that that's necessarily the best population, because preferred beverage consumption is not necessarily educationally focused depending on the situation. So it's really just making sure that the population is relevant to the topic under study. And again, we toss these words around a lot, risks and benefits, and again, it is important to acknowledge that all studies involving human participants are going to have some amount of risk. Certainly in social behavioral research, most of those risks are probably going to be pretty minimal, especially when dealing with non-vulnerable adults or a non-sensitive topic. But at the same time, confidentiality, being sensitive to people maybe getting stressed during an interview, things of that nature. And we in the IRB certainly understand that there are going to be risks. That's just a fact. But there are ways to minimize them. And like I said before, pointing to the benefits is if we can see that the benefits of a potential study outweigh the risks and the risks have been minimized, then that researcher has done a good job of being able to address those ethical concerns. And so it's really just important to consider risks and benefits as kind of a ratio. We're really just looking to make sure that the benefits of the study outweigh the potential risks. And again, a lot of those factors as far as why the study is being conducted in a certain place, what the researcher's position in the organization is, all of those things come into play as we're making that risk-benefit analysis. So now we're going to move on to the poll question. So Lori, I'll let you move into that screen and just provide a little bit more. You can all read the question, but please feel free to answer any and all options. We're really just curious at this point to see what type of locations either you or your students have indicated where they might want to conduct the study, just so that we can try to even tailor our presentation here today a little bit more in case we have a lot of people focusing one way or another. And it is just interesting too to see what students are indicating that they're doing their research. So Lori, I don't know if you have anything you want to add at this point.
I don't. The only thing I would add is that on the previous screen that you saw, the fifth choice is nonprofits, and we changed that to other on the actual poll, so there was a little bit of discrepancy in your choices. But the spirit is to identify those settings in which students at Walden may conduct research. And we have about half of you have voted. If you've never participated in a poll before, just click right on the screen. You can choose as many of these as you like, and kind of comments, other incorporations of types other than provided. And that's correct. And Jenny's going to talk a little bit about some of the other settings that research may be conducted in. And so I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. Most of us have voted. And, excuse me. And as we're looking at the results of the poll, which should be up here in just a second, we see that most of us chose, or over half of us chose all of them. And so, Jenny, do you want to talk about that just a little bit?
Sure, thank you. Yes, and just to let everybody know, this is a very, very condensed list. We actually could only limit it to 5 options. But at the same time, it is one of those things where we have actually been tracking over the past few years where our students are conducting their studies, and it's really, in my opinion, it's very interesting and very illuminating to see all the various locations where our students are conducting research, and you know, schools, medical facilities. Again, we've got these broad topics, but again, a school could be anywhere from a daycare, preschool, clear all the way up to university and college. You know, working with the military or government also has its own issues. We've got students also more of the community level, maybe at a state or public policy type things. And again, religious or nonprofit types of organizations. Again, it's always very illuminating and very encouraging to see where our students are at. But this is very helpful also just as we're kind of doing some examples and whatnot to try to focus a little bit more, provide some more real scenarios based on where we're seeing students, of where some of your own students are doing their studies. So this is very helpful.
Jenny, David asked why not have corporations as a category, and David, we just chose some. Corporations is certainly a category where our students can and do research. We were just trying to give a sampling of some of those places, so we apologize if there were any misunderstandings there. Anything you want to add to that, Jenny?
No, and again, the only reason is that we had to limit it to 5 options. And in all honesty, the 5 that we had was condensed from a list of about 40. So we do have, there was no rhyme or reason, just very broad categories based on the limited option abilities. Any other questions?
Not at this time.
Okay. Well, moving on then. Again, there are, as I said before, we definitely want to encourage students, faculty conducting research in their own workplaces, but there are some very tangible obstacles that need to be considered and addressed. And it's something that certainly the earlier students start thinking about these issues and incorporating what they're going to do to address them, the better it will be in the long run. It certainly is never too early to start thinking about these. The first issue is this issue of social desirability. And again, as I said before, is we draw a lot of students that are purposely wanting to conduct research in their place of employment. And so it is one of the things where because they're there, they're talking to their coworkers, they're talking to their friends about being in school. You know, it's as people are there, as they start learning about, you know, what is interesting to the student, the participants could then decide, well, out of loyalty to this friend or loyalty to the organization, or you know, maybe even wanting to look good to their boss, it could lead to an effect where participants are providing responses based on what they think the researcher would want to hear, as opposed to what it is that they're actually thinking. This is further compounded by studies in which anonymous methods are not used. Again, if it's a study where it's possibly using interviews, people might be concerned about providing their true responses, especially on something where maybe it's a newly instituted policy that isn't really all that favorable or all that well liked in an organization. But again, people might be afraid to speak up against it because they don't want to, you know, seem like they're a bad worker or seem like they are not playing along, or you know, they want to maintain that positive attitude. And so, you know, those are all things that go into it. And again, it's, you know, if you're trying, when students are trying to conduct that research, of making sure that they've had those steps in place to make sure that they've minimized some of those social desirability aspects. This next one is a bit more difficult for some students to wrap their heads around, especially seeing the various levels that coercion can manifest itself. Clearly, and I think a lot of people fully understand this, that when there's a power differential, a supervisor versus a subordinate, a teacher and a student, doctors, patients, therapists, clients, it is a little bit easier to see how there could be that perception that you're expected to participate. Supervisors hold the power to determine further employability, whether they get a raise, further benefits, promotion opportunities, what their working environment will be. Doctors and therapists are responsible for ensuring patient and client care. And specific to education, this is one that sometimes gets overlooked, is teachers really, they are the ones that are responsible for determining student grades, reporting on what is going on with other teachers to help address student progress. And these are all, again, it's regardless of how well liked or what the person's role is, that perception of feeling like somebody has to participate really is something that can be very difficult to account for, because it can be very difficult to find workable solutions when this issue isn't fully addressed. When students feel like because they're just a well-liked teacher, then everyone will want to participate, well, that's great that they're very well-liked, but they also have to take that step back and look at, well, if they're participating because they feel this sense of loyalty, that is just a different way of coercion manifesting itself. And again, we see this presenting itself largely in that power differential, but researchers and students especially really do also need to consider that this element is existent even if they are a peer or an equal to those that they are collecting data from. Again, because these are students, they've been in these workplaces for a while, probably have been discussing that they're in school, their excitement about what they're doing. Some coworkers may feel compelled to participate, either, like I said before, to help out a friend, or because they might recognize that, well, this person could one day be my boss, and I want to do what I can to stay in their good graces. And again, it's just identification of these issues is really the first step, and we'll get into some workable solutions a little bit later, but really helping students to identify that it's not always as clear as black and white, that the issue of coercion that needs to be considered. It's really understanding the various levels that can go into that, and recognizing that it can come even when least expected. The biased responses, again, goes a little bit back to what we were discussing with regards to social desirability, and really would be quite prominent in studies where the data collection does not use anonymous methods. And by anonymous, we mean that no identifiers are collected, and not even the researcher is able to identify who participated. So if a study involves interviews, clearly the researcher would know who is participating, would know who would provide those responses, and this could lead to participants feeling, like I said before, that they need to provide responses in a way that they think the researcher wants to hear. And again, yes?
Yeah, we have a couple questions. There's one about interviews, so if you don't mind me jumping in right now. David asks, is there a problem with the location of the interview, whether it's on-site or not?
Good question. That would be dependent on actually several factors. The first would be the organization itself. Some organizations, while they don't mind researchers recruiting on-site, prefer for the data collection to occur off-site. either for just to ensure that the data collection does not interfere with the workday, or to provide that additional level of privacy for the participant. For those organizations that maybe do allow on-site data collection, ensuring that the interviews are conducted in a discrete, private location, an office where the door can be closed, a classroom, just someplace, or a conference room, again, where the door can be closed and the interviews won't be heard by the general passerby. Conducting it in a cubicle where the walls are really low and everybody can hear what's going on, not an ideal location for an interview. So ensuring that those privacy risks are addressed is definitely something that needs to be considered.
And then one other question, kind of a general question. Gene asks, he says, supervisors may provide information on a need to know. Subordinates and those at lower pay grades may give information that makes them look good, both impacting the reliability of the data. An outside researcher will avoid the internal reliability issues. Given this, are not most studies at work suspect to the reliability of the data?
Yes, and that, again, is a great example of this issue of the social desirability and the biased responses, and issues that the student researcher will need to address, either proactively in, maybe determining that doing the study in his or her own workplace is not the best location due to some of these biases and the researcher's own biases, or again, addressing them as limitations on the back end. Explaining, again, due to various issues or the nature of how it was collected, the nature of their relationship, addressing that those are possible concerns, and certainly something that faculty in their role as committee members and URRs to help students understand that, again, in collecting data from their friends and coworkers, there is that element of, wanting to help out a friend, wanting to help someone get ahead, that they certainly do need to account for and address at some point throughout, either, again, on the proactive end or on the back end as a limitation. And then just one other thing with the biased responses, and I think this goes a little bit to the issue that we were just discussing as well with, the reliability of the data being suspect, is student researchers also need to be aware that sometimes there are going to be people in their environment where they have their own agendas, and they could very easily try to use the students' research to try to push their own agenda. So rather than really addressing what it is that the student is trying to focus on, they're basically trying to essentially take over so that they can get their voice heard in a way that they feel like they can't in any other way. And so students, and again, that certainly is relevant, no matter where a study is conducted. But when we're dealing with people that we work with day in and day out, students really need to be aware of that possibility, and to really try to keep that focus very clear on the study and on the topic at hand, to avoid getting too far out into left field and having it be just a launch pad for somebody to essentially voice all their grievances or push their crusade in a manner that really wouldn't be beneficial to the student, nor would it further the research in any way. And again, this last issue with the confidentiality breaches, we discussed this a little bit, is when you are conducting research at your place of employment, you do need to be careful where you are collecting the data. Again, if an organization does approve for on-site data collection, which is very common and certainly allowable, it is taking those extra steps to make sure that the conversation can't be overheard, possibly suggesting to maybe conduct the interviews maybe after work or before work, so that way people, to minimize maybe who would overhear it if they're walking by the door. Another thing to consider, though, and certainly something that is not something that many researchers think about, but it is essentially the storage of the data. A lot of times, we all have our work laptops, our home laptops, our home computers, and we tend to use them interchangeably at times. But at the same time, with our work with our work computers, we often forget that they're connected to a server. They're connected to other computers, and they're very easily accessed by other people. And so storing data on a work computer or on a work server really is not the best idea, because you're opening up that data to other people within the organization. And that's something that students really need to be mindful of. It's definitely better for them to keep their data on their own personal computer or in their own personal home office rather than their work office. Another thing is to consider, how they're collecting the data or how they're communicating. We do see some students where they want to collect data via email. They send out maybe email questionnaires and want participants to email the responses back to them. But if they're using a work email address to do that, there are some organizations where management or IT have that ability to look at any emails being sent. And so those are really just all things that students need to consider as they're developing their topics and developing the nuts and bolts of their data collection, to make sure that the data is not inadvertently overheard or seen by somebody else. Do you want to go to the next slide, Lori?
Yeah, a couple questions while we're advancing the slide, if that's okay. David
Perfect.
is wondering if there are any particular issues about confidential data within a corporation. Not
any specific issues. That would certainly be, I'm trying to phrase this, it would really be on an organization-to-organization basis. The one main point that I would point out is that, again, many of our students, especially if they're collecting data from their own place of employment, it is important for students to make sure that they obtain the proper approval from the organization representative to use that data. Many students seem to think that just because they work for an organization and have access to the data or to information as part of their jobs, they can just automatically take it and use it for their research. And that is not the case. If it's private data, if it's data that's not generally available to the public, a student does need to make sure that they have the appropriate organizational approval to use that information. And if they're not sure who to contact, just starting with any level, human resources or a manager or somebody, and working their way to make sure that they have those proper approvals. If it's somebody that owns the organization, there's different issues that we would need to look at. But generally, when it comes to using organizational information, many organizations have their own policies that students also need to make sure that they consider and address those organizational concerns.
Okay, a couple more questions here before we go on, if that's okay. Wendy is wondering, are anonymous paper and pencil surveys acceptable in the workplace, and any advice about how they should be distributed?
Anonymous paper and pencil surveys? Okay, yeah, and just in general, anonymous surveys are fantastic. If a researcher, especially one conducting research in their place of employment, can use an anonymous survey, we certainly encourage that. It minimizes the risk. It maximizes the possibility that people will provide true and honest answers because they have no fear of having their names associated with it. If this researcher wants to use a paper and pencil, really there are different methods that could be used. One might be, maybe just distributing them to, like a school setting, they have mailboxes. So they could, just leave the surveys in the mailbox and have them get returned to a locked box in a central location. Or maybe having them be, maybe even returning them to a researcher's office directly. If an organization maybe has an internal mail system, anonymous paper surveys could be returned through that internal mail system. There really are different options, and certainly, they could even be returned directly to the researcher. And again, I'm thinking educational settings, it's a little bit easier to use an example where if an educator was administering, say, a survey to, in a group setting, not during class time, but, students come to a classroom at a certain point and complete a survey at that time, and they all complete it, it could then be returned to the researcher at that time. So there's no one specific way that anonymous paper and pencil surveys, and there are certainly various options that researchers could use specific to the location of where they're conducting their study.
Thanks, Jenny. We have another question. I'm not sure this is within the scope of this webinar, but perhaps you could just briefly address it. The question comes from Amy. It's about students collecting data from student, staff, faculty at Walden, and she's wondering if Walden has some specific policies and how a student, or I guess anyone, would go about getting permission.
That actually is something that would need to go through the Office of Institutional Research and Assessment. I'm not exactly, unfortunately, I don't have access to the faculty portal, but on the faculty portal there is actually a form that needs to be completed. It's the Institutional Approver Request Form, and any request to use any Walden student data, faculty, or include Walden students or faculty in research would need to be submitted through that department, and they would make the determination.
Okay, thank you. And then just one last quick question. Kana is wondering, what's the proper way of making anonymous the company name in a report? She said she used a Midwestern university, here and after referred to as the university, but then she's gotten students making up phony names for the company, claiming that it was an IRB direction.
We actually don't have a position in that regard. We generally refer students to the Writing Center. Our position is that we just want to make sure that participants are protected. Participants should not be identified in any report. And from an organizational level, if an organization were to be named, the student would just want to make sure that they obtain the approval from the organization to include their name. And that's an issue that the student would need to take. When de-identifying information about the organization or where the study was completed, students should work with the Writing Center to find out what possible options are in that regard.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, and again, moving on towards some more practical applications to help students that want to conduct research in their place of employment. Again, it is first identify the issues that they need to understand, work towards possible solutions. The biggest thing that they need to realize, again, is this recognition of the authority, their own personal authority in the organization. Again, going back to those Belmont report basic ethical principles, these are things that researchers need to consider on a very basic level. If you have a student who is a supervisor or a teacher or a doctor, ensuring that the study is generated in a way so that the employees or students or subordinates, whoever is included, feel that their participation is voluntary. If the student were to use their position to try to force other individuals in the organization to participate, this would be essentially going against the initial principle of respect for person. Making sure that they have that their individual decision to participate needs to be respected. And again, in addition to not making them feel like they have to participate, is the back end of not making them feel like they'll be retaliated against if they don't participate, or if they provide information that's maybe not what the student wants to hear, or even beyond that, what the organization wants to hear. Whether it's whether the student is researching something that's compliant with organization policies, or maybe the results find something that makes an organization look a little bit less than positive. Really making sure that participants know that they won't lose their job due to participating in the study. And again, going back to that justice principle, as well as making sure that the topic regardless of where it's being conducted, that the population is adequately equipped to address the topic. Making sure that you're not using your own place of employment just because there's a large amount of people there. Really making sure that the topic is specific to the population at hand. Again, the identifiable data, and this is the second point, is a bit of a very strong sticking point, and it is something that our students definitely need to understand, is that we do not allow leaders or managers, supervisors to collect identifiable data from their subordinates. Again, this really just goes back to those ethical principles. There's just no good way to balance that respect for persons and to have it, regardless of what the student researcher may say, it's the perception that the subordinate needs to participate just really can't be managed. Again, this presents other options, though. Again, trying to find ways of anonymous data collection. And certainly for the qualitative researchers, we do understand that this can present, different challenges compared to quantitative researchers. But at the same time, certainly identifying, maybe instead of asking the interview questions orally, possibly just having them be a written questionnaire that people can respond, and just leave it as open-ended questions. But it really does need, and again, it goes back to that reliability issue of, in addition to ensuring that people feel like they're not being tracked, whether they participate, but people will feel more able to provide honest responses if they don't feel like their names or identities are attached to the data. We often get a question, too, of, well, I may be a principal of the school wanting to interview my subordinates, so can I just use a research assistant? The first point is no. The Walden IRB does not allow for the use of research assistants to collect data or to recruit on that, for that matter, as well. Recruitment and data collection are something that students are expected to do themselves, so that is not something that could be delegated. But even so, this does not mitigate the perception of coercion, because the person could feel that the research assistant would just go and tell the researcher what he or she said anyway. And so, again, it is that balance. And then just one other small point with regards to identifiable data. Often, it's not just collecting identifiers. Student researchers also really need to be aware of how the demographic data they are collecting could be used to possibly deduce who participated. The general rule of thumb is that any data point should not be attributed to fewer than 3 individuals. So a more practical example is, if a principal is collecting data from teachers at the school using an anonymous survey, which is great, but asks for the teacher's gender, specific age, the grade that they teach, and the number of years teaching at the school, well, that combined information could be very specific to some teachers. If there's only one male 3rd grade teacher, then it's very obvious who provided that data. There are different ways, of addressing this. One is for students to consider how much demographic data is really needed. Do they need to know the entire life history of their participants, or is it sufficient to just know gender, age, ethnicity? Other options are, maybe to consider using option ranges. Instead of asking for specific age, ask for, are you between the ages of 18 and 30 and 31 to 40? Asking, how much education they've had of having, or grades taught, elementary, middle school. That way the data points received from that are a bit broader and then cannot be attributed to fewer people. So students do need to be aware of that also as they're constructing that type of information. Next slide, Lori.
Okay, well, we're going on to the slide. Dean has, he's wondering about a clarification, if you don't mind. He says, it was my understanding that the Walden IRB does not want the organizations identified, and students must use a pseudonym or just refer to the organization to keep the identity of the organization confidential. Moreover, in small organizations, providing the organizational name will identify the participants, just as you described. Was your statement about using the organization's name a change, or did he hear you incorrectly?
Could you repeat that question, just the tail end of it? Because I'm not quite sure where a change would have come in.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. I was coughing. Can you repeat? Did you have a question?
Yeah, could you just repeat the end of that question? Because I'm not sure I understood.
Okay, sorry about that. You said you made a statement about using the organization's name. Has there been a change there, or did he just hear you incorrectly?
Well, the Walden IRB has not really ever had any official position with regard to naming organizations in the final document. And so I can't really address whether that's considered a change because I don't have a policy to relate that to. But again, it's our stance on the issue is that participants need to be protected, and so steps need to be taken to ensure that participant identities are not disclosed. Sometimes that does require that, withholding a name of an organization is necessary because, depending on the organization, it could be very easy to identify who participated. But again, that whether or not to specifically name, that's our stance on it. But again, or whether to name it an organization would require organizational approval. And if the organization states that they don't want their name included, then the student should work with the Walden Writing Center to address, what are some options that can be used to describe rather than name the organization.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. Dean, if that doesn't answer your question, send some additional follow-up to the IRB email that we'll give at the end and make sure that we get that clarified and that you understand what you need to do there. Thanks, Jenny. Go ahead.
Okay. Again, just some last, really critical points students should consider as they are trying to identify some workable options for conducting research in their place of employment. And this first one, I can't stress enough, recruitment really does matter. We have a lot of students where they put a lot of their energy on ensuring the data collection is sound, and they've done what they can to protect participants, and that's great. But then they've not thought at all about recruitment, and their recruitment actually causes more problems than their data collection ever would. And it is really important that students understand that they need to consider the entire process, not just the data collection. Things that they should consider is, whether to recruit participants individually or in a large group setting. If students want to recruit in a large group setting, presenting information about a study is okay, but asking them to maybe make a decision on the spot really is not ideal because they don't have time to consider participation. Certainly doing consent in a group format is not acceptable. That's something that would need to be done on a more individual basis. But also considering, maybe less direct methods of recruitment, depending on the role of the person in the organization and the sensitivity of the data, maybe using a flyer or an email would work a little bit better rather than walking up to somebody or cold calling them or, inviting them to their office, because it can be more difficult for some people to say no in person. rather than self-selecting into a study based on a posted invitation. For surveys, again, streamlining the process to minimize the researcher's presence. Maybe including a direct link to an online survey, or include the survey with the consent form so it can be returned, maybe in a self-addressed envelope, or like I said, a locked box in a central location. That way the participant doesn't have to go to the researcher to get the survey. And especially with surveys, again, recognizing that consent is a process. It's for anonymous surveys, implied consent is okay. So not collecting signatures using an anonymous survey is okay. And even if directing students to the sample consent form that's on our website, we actually have text that they can use for their own studies to explain how implied consent can work, because then it's the completing of the survey indicates their consent rather than that documentation. So again, it's remembering that consent is the process, not the signature. Again, the method of data collection, we can't go over this or highlight this enough, is it all depends on the nature of the position of the researcher. Certainly if it's a teacher wanting to collect data from other teachers, doing interviews, observations is much more feasible than a principal wanting to do the same. Again, it's that power relationship, that power differential that is such the big inhibitor in those cases. When there is that top-down power differential, researchers are limited to anonymous data collection or secondary data analysis. And the secondary analysis of the secondary data, that could include, organizational documents, student test records, policies, employee records, those types of things. It's essentially any material that the organization has and would be able to release to the researcher. This does make for an actually a very clean option for some researchers, because it allows them access to a data set that they might not have in any other capacity. And so it certainly is something for many researchers to consider if that's a possibility. And again, participant privacy, something that's important to consider throughout the entire process. Again, just considering where in the organization the data will be collected. If using a private conference room is certainly preferable to using a cubicle. Timing of the data collection, making sure, it's maybe not during working hours. A lot of organizations, really, like I said, prefer for data to be collected outside of the working hours so that the research doesn't interfere with the workday. Again, will it be overheard? Will management have access to those issues or to those emails? All of those things need to be taken into consideration. And then, Lloyd, you just want to go to the next slide?
Yep, and we are at like 3 minutes to the top of the hour, so if we want to summarize quickly and be sure we get to the slide where we provide the contact information.
Yep. Yeah, and so this is actually, again, is just the really important takeaways and those practical solutions. Again, being prepared. Boy Scout motto, it's never too early to begin thinking about ethical issues. Really, we have many, many documents on our website. We have an FAQ that is specific to conducting research in your own place of employment. Definitely encourage your students to check out our website, get familiar with those documents early so that they can utilize that feedback as they're developing their proposal. Additionally, the key one there at the bottom, being flexible. Again, we really want to encourage students and meet them where we're at to the best of our ability, and we certainly see the IRB review as a dialogue, and there is room for negotiation. But students do need to keep in mind that there are sometimes additional factors that need to be considered that just require that data be collected one way or the other. And if you want to go to the last slide, Lori.
Nope.
Again, these are just some really useful tools that are available to students and to faculty as well. The first two documents are available on our website, so definitely encourage your students to review those. And then certainly if they have any questions, please feel free to have them, or you can email the IRB directly at any time at irb@waldenu.edu.
Thanks, Jenny. And I know that there were a few questions that didn't get answered. There seems to be a continuing conversation about using the organization's name and de-identifying the organization in the manuscript. So if you have questions for Jenny or the IRB, you can use this address. If you have questions for the Writing Center, you can certainly reach out to them as well. If there are other outstanding questions, I'm going to go ahead and offer Jenny to answer those. And if you would just send those to irb@waldenu.edu, the email address you see on the screen. Someone from the Center for Research Quality would be happy to have a conversation with you, answer your questions. You will get a copy of a link to a copy of this presentation and a link to the recording either later today or tomorrow. I'll be sending that out. With that, I'd like to thank Jenny for all the great information you've shared. This really was an informative IRB. I learned some things myself. Thank you so much for joining us and for all your great conversation and questions. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.